Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, I am really happy that we have a unique opportunity tonight to have a very interesting guest with us, and I'm also very happy to have a joint event of Estonian Council of Foreign Relations and International Center for Defense and Security. This is almost, I could say, like a kickoff of very important week. End of this week, as you know, we will again host in Tallinn Lennart Meri's conference, which will start in just 2 days' time. But I hope that what we'll have tonight is something what gives very good food for further discussions, both here in Estonia, but obviously also among our allies and primarily in the UK. It is really my great honor to introduce Tom Tugendhat, a member of the British Parliament since 2015 and a former Minister of Security. Tom has spent his life in service of his country, first as an officer in the British Armed Forces, including operational deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, and later in the heart of public life in Westminster. In those years in uniforms, he served alongside allies who stood shoulder to shoulder with Britain, including Estonian soldiers in Afghanistan. That experience is not just history, it is a reminder of what binds us together when it matters most. Tom has never spoken lightly about security or freedom. He speaks from experience, from service, and from conviction. At the moment when Europe once again faces tests of resolve, his message is simple and unambiguous. Peace is not preserved by wishful thinking, but by clarity, unity, and strength. I have known Tom as a colleague and good friend, and I have always respected his seriousness of purpose, his moral clarity, and his refusal to look away from difficult truths. And it is my privilege to welcome Tom here today. Please join me in giving Tom Tugendhat a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much indeed, Marco. It's a great pleasure to be with you again and to be back in Tallinn. Thank you for welcoming me. And as you mentioned our common service in Afghanistan, you remind me of one day standing on the flight line waiting for the helicopter that never comes, which is an experience most soldiers will share. And I was standing next to an Estonian sergeant. This was in 2006 or 7. I said, first tour? He said, no, been here before. I said, oh, when was that? 88, he said. Okay, well, what was the difference? After a few moments of silence, he said, well, we had more helicopters. But look, it's a huge pleasure to be here, and I'm very grateful for the welcome that you've given me. I'm very proud to be supporting the International Center for Defense and Security this week, not just for the Lennart Meri conference, but for all the other different events that you organize. You have, in the city, organized conversations to face the tough choices that confront us today, and you've set out various ways of meeting them. And so it's a pleasure to be asked and to be invited to speak today. Now, I wanted to start by saying this is the third in a series of speeches that I've been giving in recent weeks, because I believe that Britain, and indeed the whole of Europe, has not really woken up to the dangers that we face. And that's why I started at home, setting out the British military situation honestly. Because Chinese intelligence gathering in the United Kingdom, Russian attacks on our connections in the seas and on land, and most importantly, the consequences of 30 years spent believing that we had won the Cold War and that peace now reigned eternal have finally come home, and we must face the reality. I listed Britain's failures to invest, and I also looked at where the lessons apply more widely. Now, last week at Stanford, I began to address how we respond. From San Francisco, you can imagine the answer is always tech. Of course it is. But it's actually much more than that. It's about the whole industrial might that must be brought to bear to resist aggression. It's about the whole of society preparations needed to build up resilience so that we can endure and not just strike. As I put it in California, it's not just about armies. Armies go on operations. It's nations that go to war. Nations prepare and nations endure. And that means industry, academia, in fact, the whole of society, not just the military, must prepare. And that brings me here tonight in Tallinn. And what I wanted to talk to you about people. Because when we talk about society, that's what we really mean. We mean people. It is the area of our greatest vulnerability, the division between us and the lies that separate us. And we're seeing our freedoms exploited every day to destroy the trust that holds us together. Too few of us are facing the reality of the challenge that our enemies are massing against us. But here in Estonia, you have faced that reality earlier and more actively than most. Many of us, sadly, have chosen not to believe in the devil. But as we see every day in Ukraine, and particularly in the massacres of Irpin and Bucha, the devil is alive and walks among us. Evil exists, and we need to be ready to fight, something you have never forgotten. About a decade ago, I was talking to an Estonian friend about e-citizenship and the whole e-society that you have built. And he said, it means that we will be ready when the Russians next attack. He said, it will allow us to be a people without a country. They won't be able to destroy us. Now, at the time, I thought he was paranoid. Today, I think he was prepared. What we have seen consistently, not just under Vladimir Putin, but under Russian rulers for centuries, is the violent ambition of the tyrant. They have murdered millions and tortured more. Again and again, we have seen a corrupt princeling in Moscow look with envy on the successes of free nations of Europe and suffer the violence that has followed. That's the reality that you have always known. And in London and other capitals, we have grown far too comfortable and complacent in a way that you never did. So I understand why so many here are exercised over the question of America's pledge to NATO. Watching the current administration question their commitment to our shared defence is indeed very worrying. But are we truly focused in the right place? I ask that question because over the last 30 years, while the Americans have maintained their military, others have cut the cloth and hidden the gaps in their promises. Britain and others have not paid their table stakes for decades, but seen their promises be turned from weapons into words. I wonder, is it the United States that is walking away, or are they forcing us to face the reality of decades of self-deception? If it's the latter, let's face it, that's welcome. Of course, that's not true of you, and indeed it's not true of many of your partners and allies. You have been carrying your share of the burden this whole time, spending some 3.4% of GDP on defence today and committed to 5.4% from 26 to 29. And your neighbours, many of them have done the same. Poland is at 4.5% already, rising to 4.8 next year. Latvia 3.7, Lithuania at 4, and they've committed to between 5 and 6% from 2026. And then, of course, there's Finland. Outside the alliance until recently, Helsinki has never forgotten what it took to stop the Red Army and has never dropped its guard. When they joined NATO, they didn't just add to our security, they brought an attitude and approach we in Britain need to learn from. And along with Sweden, they shifted the alliance north, reminding me of the bonds we shared in the past under the Viking kings or the Hanseatic treaties. Then we were expanding and trading. Today, we're protecting what we have built together. So let's look at it, and let's look at what's threatened. Because for years now, Russia has been conducting warlike acts against us, trying to undermine our democracy and our freedom. We have hidden behind diplomatic dances and weasel words because honesty would have forced us to make choices we wanted to avoid. Now, personally, I've had enough of the obfuscation and the evasion. It is time to say it clearly. The Kremlin is at war with Europe, and their allies in Beijing are helping. Just look at their crimes. In 2006, the FSB murdered Alexander Litvinenko in London using a chemical so toxic, traces from it were later found at more than 40 sites across the city, including on the British Airways flight that his killers flew in on. In 2016, Russian military intelligence plotted to seize the Montenegrin parliament on election night, assassinate the prime minister, and install a pro-Russian government to halt the country's accession to NATO. In 2018, the GRU poisoned the Skripals with a nerve agent in Salisbury. The perfume bottle they left behind still contained enough to kill a mother of 3. And in fact, if it had been raining that night and the bottle had tipped into the sewer, it would have got into the water supply and killed thousands. And in 2024, the Kremlin spent more than $200 million, the equivalent of around 1% of Moldova's GDP, on interfering in the country's presidential election and EU referendum. President Sandu has said her government has evidence that 150,000 votes were bought, with the target having been twice that number. Now, that's not all. The same year, the GRU sent incendiary devices disguised as pillows through the DHL network. One caught fire in a warehouse in Birmingham and another at a hub in Leipzig. German intelligence told the Bundestag that the only reason a cargo plane did not go down over Europe was because the flight was delayed. That year, Germany faced more state terrorism. United States and German intelligence operations disrupted a Russian plot to assassinate Armin Papager, the chief executive of Rheinmetall, Europe's largest producer of artillery shells. He was one of several European defense industry executives on a Russian target list. The record here, of course, is just as serious. In 2007, Estonia was the first NATO member subjected to coordinated state-directed cyber attacks, when 3 weeks of denial of service operations targeted your ministries, your banks, and your broadcasters. And of course, in 2014, we must not forget that Eston Kova, an Estonian Internal Security Service officer, was dragged across the Russian border by FSB agents and paraded on their state television before being sentenced in a vastly unfair trial to 15 years in a penal colony. Time and again, we have seen how Russia violates our sovereignty and threatens our peace. Their imperial ambitions are not dead. Let's face it, they're not even sleeping. But many have barely responded. Time and again, the alliance has barely moved. We expelled a few more diplomats, we imposed a few more sanctions, we issued a few more statements. And usually, Moscow barely even noticed and saw us as easy to push around. Now, they weren't wrong. Too many of us have not been serious. And worse, too many have been complicit. In 2014, France's Rassemblement National took a loan from a small bank in Moscow after European banks declined to lend to them. When the bank collapsed, the debt was passed to a Russian aviation company that the German Marshall Fund's analysts have now linked to Russian intelligence. A French parliamentary committee subsequently found that the party had operated as a relay for Russia in French politics. In 2024, Moscow so corrupted the Romanian elections that the first round of the presidential polls had to be annulled when their agents got an unknown candidate within touching distance of the presidency. Now, Russia did not do that alone. It was a coordinated TikTok and Telegram operation with China's hands all over this new online army. They have been helped by useful idiots and corrupt co-conspirators, former leaders of our nations who have betrayed us all, bowing, or in fact, in Austria's case, curtsying to our enemies and their money. Former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder joined the board of companies used by Putin, not only to rob his people, but to bribe ours. Former Austrian Foreign Minister Karin Kneißl abased herself before Putin at her wedding and now degrades herself propagandizing for Russia. In Britain too, sadly, I have to confess, we have our own traitors. Shamefully, a British member of the European Parliament and former leader of the Reform Party in Wales, got 10 years in prison for spouting Kremlin's rubbish for cash. They have taken their 30 pieces of silver. Dirty money has corrupted our politics, and now, sadly, cryptocurrencies are making it harder to trace. Now, it would be easy to laugh these incidents off, to claim that these failed politicians are simply echoes of a rather tawdry 1960s spy story. But the truth is actually much darker. At the heart of each of these attacks is people, and the currency of people is trust. And that is exactly what Putin is targeting. Because that is the center of gravity for all of us, and so the center of gravity for all the operations prosecuted by Moscow. This sustained campaign across every avenue against the political integrity of our European democracies. Millions to a party or to a politician here, another denied, but let's face it, obvious attack over there, and the spreading of division online, the use of obvious lies, not because anybody is expected to believe them, but so that people believe that there is nothing that is true and everything is to be doubted. It is, let's face it, unrelenting, and it is conducted below the threshold at which we've so far displayed a willingness to respond. Now that's our mistake, and we're paying for it with more violence, more disorder, and more distrust. We've answered the hard currency of force with the soft currency of words. We've pretended that international law binds us. The truth is, it doesn't bind us all. It only binds we who obey. Vladimir Putin hopes to convince our fellow citizens that we can't trust each other, that our democracies can't protect us, and that we're all the same. And you have to admit, he's doing rather better than any one of us would have liked. But that's why the truth matters. It sets us apart from Moscow. It's not just their rampant corruption, their brutality, and their hatred of us and, of course, of each other. It's that we know that cooperation, democracy, enterprise, and opportunity are true, and our freedoms are the values that we share from Vancouver to Tallinn and that we have built on. That's what our alliance depends on. So why don't some pay their dues? Why are they slow in realizing the threat? To be honest, everything feels more pressing with proximity, but the cyber and information operations don't care about distance. What matters is honesty and unity. When we stand together, we understand what matters, then we're ready to face them. But talking of honesty, it brings me to a statement that I heard in the House of Lords by a British minister, and to an apology I think needs to be made. Last year, while witnessing the brutality of Russian troops raining down on Ukrainian civilians, Lithuania made a statement to protect its own children from that future. They announced that they would withdraw from the Ottawa Treaty that prohibits the use of landmines. Now, that can't have been an easy decision because we all know that mines stay in the soil for decades, and the risk to your own civilians' lives, not just to the enemy soldiers, is real. But when you see the pattern of rape and murder and torture that has been rampant in Ukraine, who can blame them? Who can really blame them for taking that risk? Well, Baroness Chapman chose to do just that, and she was wrong. Britain should stand with our allies and understand the difficult compromises that frontline states must make to defend their homes and families. We are in absolutely no position to lecture them from the luxury of distance. Instead, we must learn. And the war that we see being fought in Ukraine is still not the war that we are preparing for, not just in our defense ministries, but in our wider society. We are integrating the lessons too slowly and not alerting our people to the realities of modern conflict. What Ukraine has achieved is not just a procurement story or a military success, but a lesson in national mobilization, producing drones cheaply and at scale, redesigning them in weeks, not years, with software updated by civilian programmers and factories in homes and barns across the country. Kyiv has shortened the feedback loop, so the link between a frontline platoon commander and the startup founder equipping him now runs in hours, not in months. And as with so many other things, the Baltic states, Sweden, Finland, and Poland have been applying these lessons faster than anyone else in NATO. The Estonian defense industry, indeed, has expanded beyond recognition in 3 years. Companies like Milrem Robotics, Frankenberg Technologies, and Threod Systems are now exporting capability to allies that a decade ago would, let's face it, not even have been able to find Tallinn on a map. and you are upgrading how you think about war. Only last month, the Estonian government cancelled a €500 million programme to replace its infantry fighting vehicles and redirected that money to drones and air defence. You looked at Ukraine and drew the obvious conclusion. Meanwhile, in London, it's reported that the Ministry of Defence has pushed through an order for more helicopters when the army wanted drones. Now, that's simply not good enough. We need to be like Poland and break old supply chains, building newer, faster, and getting what we need. Poland went to Seoul for tanks because Berlin and Paris couldn't match Korean delivery times. The K2 line builds 180 tanks in 3 years, while the Leopard line takes 5 years to build 50. Now, mass at speed has always beaten the exquisite and slow. Re-engaging our homegrown industries is vital for resilience, but what matters most is people. And again, we have lessons to draw. And here I look at Sweden's pamphlet, entitled If Crisis or War Comes, that was sent to every household. In fact, it was sent twice. And like Taiwan's version, it includes an important warning. Don't believe enemy rumours and don't repeat them. Again, they understand the power of lies. So does Putin. So does Xi. Finland trains up its civilians through structured courses that can fit around their working lives. And you in Estonia, I know, have built the digital infrastructure to keep the basic functions of citizenship running, even under occupation. If your citizens don't know where to go and what to do should the worst happen, then you're not preparing for a crisis, you're ensuring chaos. And that's why honesty matters. If, as politicians, we hide the difficult choices, we are not being kind, we're being cowards. Worse, we're risking our children's future, trading that for a quiet life for ourselves. And that's wrong. We need to make the case and find the resources, as you have done. Estonia is prioritising funding for defence over schools and hospitals, and I'm sure that's a hard sell. There is not a single person in any country who wants anything other than better outcome for their kids and care for their families. But pretending troubles will pass us by is simply not being honest. As Kiev shows, the price of conflict is so much higher than the cost of deterrence. Ukraine didn't have the choice, but we do. And the obstacle isn't the British public, it's our government. Last year, more than 170,000 young Britons applied to join the army. Fewer than 10,000 made it through. Now, we had space for more, and we did not lack for interested, motivated young people. What we lacked for was the ability to get them through the system. As Major General Nick Cowley, who's the Commandant of the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, said, the claim that there's a snowflake generation is absolute rubbish. Well, he's right, except in Westminster, where there are snowflake politicians not willing to tell the truth, not willing to pay the political price, and so pushing the cost onto our fellow citizens. But perhaps even there, we're finally beginning to wake up. The Armed Forces Bill currently before Parliament proposes to raise the recall age of service personnel to 65 and lower the threshold under which reservists can be called up. Both are very welcome, but of course we need to go further. Around 95,000 people are on a contingency list, ready to be called back to duty if needed, but you can bet it's not up to date. The practice of staying in touch with our people, of knowing where they are and what they still do, fell away after the Cold War ended. And the challenge that we face again comes back to people. How do you bring a nation together? How do you prepare for a future we know is already more dangerous than our recent past? And that's where I come back to the simple truth. It's not armies that go to war, it's nations. And as a nation, what can we do to be ready? You know, in Britain, national service is something of a dirty word. We have only forced men into uniform during a war. But what if we looked at the problem differently? What if we asked young people what they could do to help their families, their communities, and their country? Military service may not work, but public service is one way to bring the country together and ensure that we're ready. And the nature of modern warfare demands it. With youth unemployment rising, AI taking jobs, or at least that's what it's said, and many asking for work experience to show a future employer, a year or two of structured service in which a young person could choose the army, the health service, fire and rescue, agriculture, the local council or civil defence could make a huge difference. The military would get the share that it needs, and the other services would get what they wanted. And in return, the young person would come out with service-related perks, with skills, with a story, and most importantly, with a clear role that they be ready to step into should ever the crisis come. And of course, they'd have an understanding of their place in society. It reminds me, I'm always struck when you meet Swedes who've done national service. They'll always tell you about the night they spent guarding the royal palace, and they all have a story for what happened. Very often nothing, but somehow they make it into a story. It's moments like that that really unite a country. They are, if you like, the soft silk of shared stories. And those connections don't end at our borders, which brings me back to NATO. Now, today, Britain leads the Joint Expeditionary Force, but that leadership has been, let's face it, more in name than in fact. There are roughly 1,000 troops here in Estonia today, rising over the next 5 years to about 2,000. But given the threat that we face and the lesson in drones and mass that the Russians, sadly, are learning in Ukraine, these numbers aren't enough of a deterrence. A serious contribution would mean a continuous rotation of British troops in greater numbers through Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, backed by a reserve worthy of the name, conducting joint exercises, preparing for conflict and deterring that conflict where its fate hinges. It would mean training teams from Ukraine. It would mean being trained by teams from Ukraine, not sending training teams to Ukraine, and a revolution in the production of armaments at home. Now, after Bucha, we can never tolerate the price that the old NATO doctrine would have put upon our people. The old tripwire concept where we accept, or at least we did accept, that the Russian forces would overrun the Baltic states and we had a plan to liberate them in 180 days. That's simply unacceptable today. We must defend every inch of alliance territory from the first meter. And that means our forces must be in place now, not promised for tomorrow. And to achieve that, we need to get better at predicting the future. That's hard. It's much easier to steal it. Defence demands intelligence and the networks to collect and share it. And that once meant secrets and spies. Today, it actually often means open data and open minds. Just take one example. In 2018, volunteers working from laptops at home with no government help identified GRU officers responsible for the Salisbury poisonings. The information they used wasn't classified. It was scattered across logs and telephone metadata, pulled from commercial services or bought on the dark web and sold by corrupt bureaucrats. This is the democratization of data, accelerating the intelligence cycle as surely as the drone cycle is accelerated in Ukraine. What once required intelligence stations and moles is now within reach of anyone with imagination and the patience to use it. The book launcher that shot down MH17 was matched to a photograph posted to social media. Its crews were tracked through fitness apps. The route the convoy traveled was reconstructed from dashcam footage uploaded by strangers who had no idea that their devices were recording information pointing to a Russian war crime. Citizen journalism isn't replacing intelligence services, but it is augmenting it. It's a different skill, and we need to catch up. Britain needs a new intelligence agency, not to replace the old, but to build a new line of knowledge, a new eye on the future. And that brings me back to the core role of information, the need to keep it honest, and the need to understand what is true. Like Sweden's crisis handbook, we need to know that information and lies are part of the battle. We see it online, and we know that TikTok and other sites are created by and exploited by our enemies. Since the attacks of 2007, Estonia is already ahead. The Cooperative Cyber Defence Centre of Excellence here in Tallinn is formidable, and NATO's Strategic Communications Centre of Excellence in Riga does fantastic work. But we can build on that. We can support startups like Bellingcat and encourage citizen investigators to expose corruption and complicity. And that's why I would like to see a new agency in the United Kingdom, MI7, if you like. While MI5 focuses on protecting our home and MI6 on understanding what's going on abroad, MI7 would exploit the sinews that connect and integrate those plots, helping to expose what is hidden, often in plain sight. In intelligence work, you're always looking for a needle in a haystack. Now, in the past, you had to rake up the straw. Today, frankly, it's all around us. And the question is, how do you sift it faster and better? Britain should establish urgently this new intelligence agency dedicated to open source intelligence collection and analysis, because it needs a new culture for a new era, and it demands a new institution to succeed. Now, the strength of the agency would be, again, in its allies, but by building on open source, would be able to extend that alliance network much further. The methods of Bellingcat have countered Russian lies, but working with Estonians, Ukrainians, and many other friends around the world, would be able to build a new network integrated from day one with civilian researchers, journalists, and academics. While Five Eyes remains the core of our secret state, the new agency can open the agencies and build a northern network, a new Hansa, if you like, sharing the information that would once have kept the kings of Kiev and London safe from the princes of Novgorod, but now would keep us free, all fused into a single architecture where the picture each of us has amounts to something sharper than what any of us could muster alone. Now, I know that here I'm building on very firm foundations. Sadly, while some of our partners in Europe have struggled to clean house from the history of Soviet occupation, or indeed those who sympathized with them, you have always been very clear there will be no spies in your house. Which brings me to what I'm asking of you and demanding of us. Now, the Hansa worked because we all saw clearly that trade and security were connected. It worked because it secured the commons of the northern seas first and conducted trade in goods second. It worked for as long as it did work because we all played our part. So to you, my friends, I ask that you keep speaking up. I'm pleased when I hear you make the case in our capitals, not just yours. I'm pleased when I read op-eds that are written by people in your parliament, not just ours. I would like you to be omnipresent and irrepressible, because your experience on the front line is the lesson that we need to hear. We need to be woken from the long slumber that has captured us for far too long. The United States is right that many of us don't pay the share that we need to keep peace for all. Now, it's easy for some in London to dismiss that as bullying or in some way to claim that President Trump is behaving unusually. It's much harder to wave away when it comes from our nearest allies bearing the brunt of the threat. So you have the moral authority, and I ask you, please, use it. And as you look across the river at Narva and stare into the darkness, please ask yourself, who do you want beside you? And then ask them to step up. And now I turn to Britain. You'll have heard woven through my words the actions that I'd like us to take. But let me just be very clear. First, I would like us to be honest. We have tough choices today, but they will only get harder tomorrow. If we want to lead, if we want to deter, if we want to stand with our allies and defend the border NATO has given us the luxury of pushing more than 1,000 miles away from our own shores, we need to pay the bill and think again. We need to secure our home by planning for the worst. We need to see further into the future by looking through the information that is all around us. And we need to prepare our people so that we can invest in the technology, the people and the skills to stand beside you, watching across the Narva River and making sure the enemy doesn't try to cross. Now, I said it at the beginning, too many of us don't believe in the devil. It's easier to pretend that he's not there. But none of us can afford the comforts of childhood any longer. We are being attacked online and off. People are being murdered. Our politics is being corrupted. And this is the new battleground, our people. We are fighting the narratives that divide us and the lies that corrupt us. This is war by other means. We need a new Northern Alliance, a new intelligence agency, and greater cooperation. Only if we get that new understanding of the threats that we face and the urgency that we need to deter them, will we wake up and see what is clear before us. Our enemies are threatened, our lives are at risk, and we need to rebuild the trust at home and abroad to protect ourselves. It's time to be serious again. Thank you.